Hey, how's it going?
Hi, how you going, Destiny?
I'm doing pretty well.
Good, good, good. Thanks for having me back on. I listened to some of the things some of your clips, and I had some questions I wanted to ask you.
Yeah, sure thing. Do you want to, for a refresher for chat, do you want to remind everybody who you are, introduce yourself, whatever you feel is
Yeah, sure.
appropriate?
So I'm an economics professor in Australia. I'm an author. I've written a book called Western Fundamentalism. I'm interested in economics and ethics and religion and how economics changes the way we think in society. Do you play the piano?
Um, do you play the piano?
I do.
Okay, I play very, very, very poorly.
Oh, well, so do I.
Oh, okay. If you
I learned as an adult. It was a lifetime ambition of mine.
Gotcha. I know a lot of theory. I went to school for composition and saxophone, so I know theory, but I don't play very well. But
Okay, okay. Yeah, look, so I have a few notes. I listened to two debates which were interesting. One was with Caleb Maupin, is that how you pronounce it, about
oh
socialism.
God, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Um, and the other was with a guy called Dark Vapor, I think. Dark Vapor, yeah. Fellow in Australia. That was about your views on pro-life, pro-choice. But it was also interesting because you outlined a kind of moral philosophy there, which I wanted to ask you about because you said it was an old position, and I wondered if you'd changed it a bit. So, yeah.
Yeah, sure thing.
Which one do you want to do first?
We can start wherever you want to.
Okay, well, so the debate with Caleb was interesting. That was about socialism versus capitalism, and I know you do a lot of these things. So, just by way of reminder, there was a lot of discussion in it about central planning versus markets. There was a bit of a discussion about what to happen when what Labor wants clashes with what's good for the environment. And there was also a lot of examples about central planning, going backwards and forwards about whether the Soviet Union and Maoist China was such a great idea. Yeah, so first of all, something I didn't really understand about it, there was a bit of a part of the debate where you talked about how when what workers want clashes with what's good for the environment. And I thought that you were maybe in danger a little bit of doing the fallacy of the special problem, where you say that something's a difficulty in this system, therefore that speaks against this system. Whereas I didn't really understand from the debate why that isn't a difficulty in both systems, in both a command economy and a...
Yeah, I agree. I 100% believe it is a difficulty in both systems. Generally, when I'm presented with a positive argument, I usually provide arguments against it. Not to say that like the problem only exists in their solution, but usually what I'm trying to point out is that the problem exists in both solutions. So, for example, oftentimes when I argue with people like that Caleb guy, there's another guy called Ben Burgess, Michael Brooks, I've heard these arguments that basically amount to if the workers were in control of the means of production, or even if they were more heavily unionized, the workers would make more responsible decisions about the environment. But I usually point out that I feel like environmental harm occurs because of how strange environmental damage is, namely that the effects aren't felt locally, and then the effects are usually felt long, like down the road in terms of time, and that these two things are what make it hard to deal with. And that whether the workers control the means of production or a capital owner controls the means of production, neither one of those gets us closer to a solution, which actually requires like heavy intervention from a third party that is capable of like arbitrating how the parties ought to act. Sorry, that was wordy, but it'd be basically when somebody argues like, oh, socialism can help this, I usually require more of an answer than just, well, the workers will make better choices. So I usually try to point out that the problem exists in both worlds, is how I go about that.
So you're concerned about having an idealized view of the workers, basically, that if they were in charge, everything would be great. And also, I agree with you, actually. That's a nice point about why these kinds of damages are difficult to deal with, because they're far away, both in distance and in time. And that's a general problem with environmental stuff, I guess, is it makes it difficult it's very hard to treat the future generations, or indeed your future self, fairly when it comes to environmental damage, which is often a mistake. You damage something now and then have to pay for it later. Okay, all right, thanks for clearing that up. You seem to both want a kind of hybrid system, or at least that's how the debate sounded to me. So Caleb didn't rule out markets, and at one point he even talked about people making money in markets, which sounded to me as though he was talking about a profit motive. I mean, he's not here to defend himself, so perhaps I shouldn't say that. But you said at various times that profits don't always work in the interest of society, which seemed to be quite a significant concession to me. So it seemed to me that both of you were moving a little bit in each other's direction at that point.
It's hard for me. Since this is a more professional conversation, I'm not going to use choice words, but I don't know what his position is. A lot of the people that I talk to are very, they conceal their actual positions quite a bit. So he's done like a lot of reporting on behalf of like China, anti-Hong Kong related stuff, basically a lot of stuff that makes me feel like he's far more I'm even hesitant to say to the left, has more of like an authoritarian bent or whatever. So I can't speak for like what his positions truly are. So when I address like his positions, I'm just going to be speaking maybe more broadly to like a socialist perspective. I just want to like clarify that. In terms of like moving in some direction, my stance on capitalism is I think that capitalism is really good and that capital can flow to areas of the economy where there's money to be made. I think that that's an incredibly powerful force that should be respected. However, just because money can be made somewhere, it doesn't mean that that outcome is like ethically beneficial for society. So for example, with the presence of externalities, sometimes it can be incredibly beneficial and profitable to engage in very pollution-heavy forms of manufacturing. We would consider that outcome to probably be detrimental to society, even though there can be money made there. So that's where I would hope the government would step in and try to make sure that profit motives align with what is also good for society. And if they don't, then there has to be some sort of like third-party cost imposed on said outcomes. So like cap and trade or some form of carbon tax would be like an example of that, I would say.
So would you call that kind of third-party control central planning or not?
No, absolutely not. That would just be like government intervention. My understanding of central planning is the idea that generally inputs and outputs in a capitalist economy are determined by like market forces or supply and demand, generally. That's simplified. And then like the government or like a party saying, these are your inputs and outputs, period, based on something that's not market forces, that would be central planning. That's my understanding of central planning. I might be wrong there, but...
No, I think that's. I wouldn't call that central planning either. But when you get governments starting to interfere in markets because profits are not doing something that's socially good, it made me wonder about another statement that you made, which is you said economic systems shouldn't deal in morality. Economic systems should just be as efficient as possible. But if you're talking about a government intervention, let's agree that it's not central planning, but a government intervention nonetheless. Isn't that kind of a recognition that economics are sort of inextricably tied up with morality, that a free market is leading to a bad outcome and you're doing something about that?
So I guess like my preference is that economics is like a descriptive study of like a state of affairs. Like economics just describes like relationships between capitalists and laborers, or how certain systems work and the outcomes they produce. That's all economics is. But when we're talking about government policy, I don't know if this is true, but I'm guessing policy either shares some Latin root with like prescription or something, but like a policy or something we ought to do, that's like necessarily like a moral statement. So for instance, if we want to have it so that everybody has health care, just because healthcare is unaffordable for poor workers doesn't mean that that's evil, or it doesn't mean that there's like an evil actor. That's just a reality of the current system. If we want to make it so that they have healthcare, then we step in with some sort of government policy or prescription that's necessarily ethically guided. I think it's important to keep it separate, that like there's a difference between the analysis of a system versus the prescriptions that we make to, I guess, like shore up an end. Maybe similarly to like how you would approach medicine, for instance. Like, I wouldn't consider like a virus or a bacteria, I would never call one of those evil. Like SARS-CoV-2 isn't evil, but COVID-19 is not a good outcome, so we create medicine to try to counteract that. So we have our descriptive analysis of how things are, but then we have like our prescriptive statements for how we want things to be, so how we could like remedy how things are. Does that make sense? Yeah.
I'm not sure the distinction can be quite as tight as that. Why would you want to get people who don't have healthcare to have healthcare? Isn't there some kind of moral dimension to that?
Yes, yeah. Anytime you're making like the prescriptive side, those have to be powered, I would imagine, by some like ethical foundation. So government policy would be like a reflection of our morality or ethics as a society.
Okay. What do you think of? So, are you aware of the kind of behavioural economics
Yes.
literature where there's actual impacts from people facing in financial incentives and dealing in markets, and it actually changes the way that they view things?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, we've read a lot about it. Yeah.
So that seems to be a bit of a blurring of your boundary, perhaps.
No, I mean, I think my understanding of behavioral economics is that's just fleshing out, making like more concise descriptive statements of how people act given, I guess, like a certain number of variables, basically, that people in some situation might make this decision, or asking why do people make, certain decisions. So like there might be decisions that people make that seem to be highly irrational. So for instance, correct me if I say anything that's really wrong, but I think the concept of like time discounting comes from behavioral economics, right?
It's been observed, but it's been assumed beforehand too.
Oh, okay, sure. But analyzing that, like why does somebody value something so much closer in time versus farther off? It seems to be highly irrational if we just like draw it out on paper, but like we try to figure out like, well, why do people feel that way? I don't think you necessarily need like a moral generator to come up with like behavioral economic statements, though, I think, or it doesn't seem to be, or maybe I'm missing something there.
Well, I just wonder, as far as I understand your position, it's that you have the economy running, doing its stuff over here, being as efficient as possible, and then you make moral decisions on the side. But what if the running of the economy over here actually has moral implications, or it generates certain outcomes which are of a moral nature? Then the idea of we can just make the economy as efficient as we can using the market system, and then we'll deal with all the moral issues over here, just doesn't, I'm not sure that that's that practical.
So my understanding right now is that that's the most practical thing. If it's not, then obviously, if I'm corrected, then I would prefer something different. But it seems like there's kind of two ways to go about things. That in one world, we could try to design an economy that, like, by virtue of that economy, it produces necessarily moral outcomes. So maybe this would be what like a socialist would aim towards, that like if every laborer, shares in the means of production, all of that extra money being generated by the capital goes to all the workers, and then society kind of takes care of itself. Or in the other world, in my world, you have an economy that works very efficiently, such that like capital flows to the most profitable parts of the market, and then a whole bunch of surplus, profit is generated, and that hopefully you can tax that and redistribute it to people that would need it. It feels like I think that the socialist model would be good if it worked, ideally, because if we don't have to redistribute anything because all of the profit is already going to all of the workers, that would be ideal. But that doesn't seem to bear out well in reality. So it seems like the latter is preferred, where you're just going to try to generate as much money as profitable, and hopefully at the end we can pick up the extra bit and then put it where it needs to go via government policy. Is kind of the line that I fall on that side of the line right now.
Yeah, I understand that position. But because both of you seem to be arguing for kind of hybrid positions, like you're prepared to have the government intervene in various ways, not in central planning sense, but in the sense of doing taxes and that kind of thing. It's not clear to me that you are making quite as clean a separation as you're saying.
Yeah, I mean, like a separation between like prescriptive and descriptive, or a separation between like capitalism and socialism.
Letting the market be as efficient as it can be and generating the most wealth, and then as a completely separate matter deciding how to dealing with any moral issues then as a completely separate matter by policies.
I guess I imagine they're tied together in some ways. Like I guess if you're intervening in markets using government policy, then you're changing the market to some extent. Yeah, I guess like my thing at the end of the day though is that there's like that profit motive engine is, I believe that that's a force that needs to be respected, because I believe it's very powerful, and that interventions that, so I guess maybe more concisely, I would say I am opposed to interventions that seem to ignore market forces, because those seem like they don't produce good outcomes for anybody on the left or the right side of things. So for instance, I would look at something like rent control, and I would say this is a type of like very morally loaded intervention that ignores market forces and seems to produce bad outcomes for literally everybody. I would use that as an example, I guess.
Yeah, it's interesting. There was a lot of discussion in the talk about examples, and examples are always fraught, I guess, because there's always special factors that people in the debate can appeal to either side. I checked up after listening to the debate on what the kind of scholarly opinion is about China, because China is an interesting case. It has a lot of state-owned capital, and yet it uses markets a lot. And I was interested in their kinds of interventions and hearing what people thought about that. And as you can imagine, it's controversial, but there is something called the Beijing consensus, which is a model of development which involves a fair bit of government tinkering with things. Now, one I know a fair bit about, because I've worked on it, is what's called the household registration system, or the HUKO system. And the way the HUKO system works is that if somebody is registered in a particular city in China, they get a lot of social benefits. If they move away from that city, they lose that registration, and they have to pay for all sorts of things that are really expensive and difficult. It's basically a way of the government controlling where people live. And as a result of this system, China's managed to pull off in its development what very few other countries have, which is to have mega cities without slums, as we would recognise. I mean, you go a lot of places in the third world, or indeed, if you go back to the original Industrial Revolution in England, the period when people started to pour out of the countryside into the cities was a period of terrible deprivation and really shocking living conditions. So China's managed to avoid that with a kind of, I guess, a heavy-handed intervention. It's not a tax; it's just basically controlling where people live. So yeah, I wonder where you put that in your baskets of interventions. Do you call that central planning, or what would you call that?
My definition of central planning is very narrow, and that when I think of central planning, I literally just think of like inputs and outputs of production are being determined by some central body. Is usually what I think of. I mean, that sounds like a pretty big government intervention, although when it comes to housing, I mean, housing has massive government intervention everywhere. Even in the United States, we have to zone, for different things, because we're not going to have a factory next to a school, next to a house, next to a restaurant. But yeah, I mean, that's definitely like some form of government control. I don't know if I'd call it central planning or not. I mean, I could. I guess I'm not too hung up on the precise words or not. But
I thought that. I think that if you want to make going back to the environmental issue, if you want to make the case that that central planning is a bad idea and taxes are a good idea, if we're going to make a distinction between taxing and central planning, that they're both about the government significantly changing market outcomes. So it's certainly not the case that the economy is just doing its thing over here, and then we worry about everything after unfettered markets have done their thing. That's not the case, but we mightn't call it central planning. I thought if you wanted to make the best case for markets as against central planning in environmental issues, you could look at that issue of taxing pollution, because let's say you've got 100 factories and they're really dirty, they're producing a lot of carbon, you want to reduce carbon. You've got 100 factories and 50 of them can do it very, very cheaply. They can reduce their carbon very cheaply, and 50 of them, it's incredibly expensive to reduce carbon. So if it's expensive for the firms, in some sense it's expensive for society. Now, a central planner would have to actually know whether a particular factory, what type it was, whether it was cheap to reduce pollution or expensive, and they'd have to tell them, you reduce, you don't reduce. They'd have to have all these knowledge of the factories. Whereas if you just put a tax in place, if you get the tax at the right level, and you can just change it until you observe the outcomes, if you get the tax at the right level, and until a point where 50 of them reduce their pollution, you've got a pretty good guess that the 50 that have reduced their pollution are the ones that find it cheapest to do so. So I think that's a nice example of how a tax doesn't require as much information. The firms themselves can self-select in. They can decide whether they're going to pay the tax or reduce their pollution, and the ones who find it cheapest to do so will be the ones that reduce it. Yeah. So I agree with you. I think that I think that central planning, which requires the kind of detailed knowledge of things that the Soviet Union aspired to, just is really hard.
Yeah, I think I've heard this called the computation problem. I don't know if that's the formal name for it, but I've heard that.
Yeah, central planning did run foul. I mean, that might change in the future. We never know what's going to happen in the future. And technology now down at the local level of information is so fantastic. The amount of information people collect about local conditions is incredible. Friedrich Hayek wrote that article on the use of information in society, which is a very famous article in the 1950s. When central planning was very much in vogue around the world, and he made that point that central planning requires such detailed local knowledge that you're better off having markets deal with that kind of local knowledge. But that might change. It's
possible, yeah. Although it does seem like there are literally, if I had to guess, pulling a number out of thin air, it wouldn't surprise me if there were literally, in just the United States, on the order of magnitude of 1 to hundreds of trillions of different little things happening like on a daily basis, just because of how many different, between banking, between restaurants, transactions from customers, inventory sorting, like there's probably so much that goes into it.
Yeah, I'd be surprised as well, but we'll wait and see.
I think when I try to draw a distinction between these two things, I guess what I'm generally looking for is like, I don't really care much. I don't care about like capitalism or socialism, or I don't care about central planning or market forces. All I'm looking for is like the best outcome. And I feel like when people moralize their descriptions of problems, I feel like what happens is we actually get away from good solutions into a world where we're proposing solutions that don't make sense. So like, for instance, in the United States, I'm going to use this as an example, knowing that it's a very complicated relationship. But like in the United States, somebody might say every worker deserves to earn a living wage, and it's like, okay, I mean, like I like the idea of that. And they go, we're going to propose a minimum wage hike of $25 an hour because every worker deserves to earn $25 an hour. In the United States, that's a lot of money. I know that in Australia, your wages are higher, but in the US, $25 an hour would be an unfathomable increase in wages. And a lot of people, from a moral perspective, might think, yeah, I think every worker deserves that much. And then we go to enact a policy, and then we might see that the outcome of that policy is incredibly negative. That now you've made it more costly for firms to hire cheap labor, more work becomes automated, and now you just have an increase in unemployment because you took a moral description of something, and instead of looking at like the real world impacts of your policy, you just did something that sounds like it's morally righteous, but it doesn't actually produce the outcomes we want. That's usually the thing I try to stay away from, or what I get the most worried about.
But do you agree with the moral description in the so there's two questions there. The morality comes in the description of the situation, but then it seems to me you're objecting to the way you go about solving it. Do you agree with the moral description that every worker deserves a living wage? With a little
bit more nuance. Like, I believe that everybody deserves like access to healthcare, food, shelter, internet, like that, which comes from a wage, which is, I imagine, what people are saying.
Internet. Okay.
Well, hold on. You laugh, but internet is really important today for most. I don't mean like internet to play video games and everything, but for job applications or for keeping up with stuff. Like, I think access to the internet is actually an incredibly poor thing for people in poverty now.
Actually, I withdraw. I agree with you.
Okay. Yeah. I know I play video games.
I'm just smiling because I'm thinking of countless generations that have preceded us, how they would regard this. But I think you're actually right.
Yeah, it's a huge problem for impoverished people to not have access to the internet today, because it's an expected thing for like every job or whatever.
Society has changed so much that's true. I think you're right.
But wait, oh God, what was I just saying before that? Oh yeah, so I agree that these are the things that people ought to have. We need to make sure that when we're enacting policies that we would realistically expect the outcomes to serve those people and not just moralize it and hope that everybody else acts, not out of their own self-interest. So for instance, if I enact a $25 an hour minimum wage, well, those companies, they better not automate because that would be a bad thing to do. Well, no, descriptively, that's exactly what we would expect them to do,
Yeah, I'd put that a little bit differently. I don't think there's anything wrong with moralizing about that at all. I actually agree with the idea that people ought to have, I would have said basic health, education and employment, but I'll add internet now. I've learned something in the conversation. Thank you.
Sure.
I would have thought that is a good moral statement, or I'd stand by that. So I don't object to the moral prescription. But I agree with you. You can go about that in a dumb or a clever way.
Yeah.
So actually, let's come back to markets for a second.
Sure.
One of the ideas about markets, talking about markets and morality, is that value is determined by the interaction of supply and demand, and that gives you a price, and that's the values that you stick with. So market values may be different to what you regard as intrinsic values, but that's the way the market system works. The market system is an organising thing. It's a pragmatic organising device, and so that's the way it works. But it does become a bit tricky when it gets to labour, doesn't it? Because some people take their wage as a kind of measure of their intrinsic worth. You even get it, I don't know if you use this phrase in the United States, but I've heard it in Australia where banks talk about high net worth clients. Do you use that phrase? Someone with a lot of money?
I mean, I've heard a lot of phrases like that, yeah. Or human capital to describe, like, laborers or, things like this. Sure.
Yeah, that's right. So there is a potential issue that I see, that if people take market valuations to be their only source of value, well, then obviously someone on a high wage is worth a lot more than someone on a lower wage.
I think that this is incredibly problematic for things that aren't necessarily tied to, well, you can argue that it flows downstream from having like a capitalist system, but yeah, I mean, I agree that people place a lot of value right now on the amount of money they make or the value of the possessions they can acquire. I don't disagree with that. My hope would be that people could separate the amount of money they make from the value they have as a person. Unfortunately, there's probably anti-profit motives for teaching people about that. I imagine in a market where you sell products, you want people to think that the acquisition of products is going to make their lives better, meaning you want to sell the most products to the most people at the highest prices, meaning you're going to have a situation like that without a lot of education to combat it. But I think that's an incredibly negative thing that hopefully we could avoid through education or cultural shift or something like that. Yeah.
Well, it is, and it is partly helped by the free market. Helped in the negative, harm. It's partly fueled by a free market liberalism approach to everything, where you really focus on market values, and you make markets extend into every area of life that you can, and that becomes your sources of values.
Yeah, I would 100% agree. You want somebody that has the $100 shirt to feel like they're a better person than somebody who has the $50 shirt. Otherwise, why would anybody buy the better product? Yeah, I agree. That's why I would say I could see it flowing downstream from that, the hyper-consumerism, like coming naturally from like a capitalistic mindset.
What do you think about central planning for a relatively small set of objectives? So you were dissing the USSR a fair bit, and it's interesting. I found it fascinating talking to a guy in Oxford about this, because it used to be that the USSR, which made very impressive increases in material output in the early 20th century after the Russian Revolution, it used to be that was a very impressive thing for a lot of people.
Okay.
And you can sort of see the same thing with China now, that people refer to it as a good example. But what do you think about? I'm sort of playing devil's advocate here, by the way.
No, I understand.
I'm not a big fan of central planning. What do you think about it for a relatively small number of well-defined goals? So, for example, the USSR beating the Nazis in World War II. That's not an easy goal, but it's a simple goal. You know what's happening. Everything gets directed towards that goal. And indeed, a lot of free market liberalism economies adopted something much closer to central planning during a wartime.
Are you referring kind of like to the concept of like total war a little bit? The idea that
a bit like central planning, isn't it?
It can be, yeah. I mean, I'm sure that there are like hyper-specific objectives that have a very limited number of inputs or outputs that a central body could harp on very hardcore and not have to worry about profit motives or not have to worry about profit loss or mistakes. I'm sure that there must be circumstances like the Manhattan Project or maybe combating, COVID-19 in the United States. Maybe there are certain cases where it is better to have like a chief body in charge of things that's not respecting like profit motive or something for, certain periods of time. I would imagine that must be the case. Yeah.
I didn't want to comment on that, but you did, so I'll pick you up on it.
Go for it.
What do you think about government responses to COVID-19? And do you think that, say, what's happened in the US is a good advertisement for decentralized decision-making and a lack of central planning?
Is this a trick question? No, I mean, obviously, I would say it's the opposite. The lack of centralization in the United States has been absolutely abysmal. I think that the United States, has probably been the most successful country in the world at showcasing how horrendously inadequate democracy can be sometimes in addressing certain problems. I'm very realistic now. My opinions about government have changed so much, but I actually think the government in the United States works in a very effective manner, and that the will of the people is actually translated to government policy sometimes a little bit too well. I think there are a lot of really dumb people in the United States. I think that their will shows every day through the government we have, through the president we've elected, through the local officials we have. And unfortunately, whether you want to blame, the proliferation of technology and fake news, or people's lack of access to good reporting, or people's lack of education in general, for some reason, it seems like there's just a lot of people in the United States that don't think it's a big deal or don't want to worry about it. And that's a huge problem that filters through to the government because our officials are elected from that same group of people.
I don't want to comment on the intelligence of people in the United States or Australia or anything like that.
Okay.
But does it, getting back to the issue of central planning, would it be an example where you would have been more in favour of central planning?
Yeah, for sure, 100%. Yeah, it should have been like almost a unilateral approach from the government, maybe with some contracting out of private companies. But for the most part, yeah, I would say so. Yeah.
Well, yes, it's in Australia. I think I'm allowed to speak a little bit more about that. In Australia, there's been a very interesting situation where in some states, so we had this policy because we don't have quite as many people travelling around the world, but the government takes people that come back from overseas and puts them up in hotels for 2 weeks and pays for everything. And in some states, this was organised by the police and the army, and in some states, it was organised by private contractors. And in the state where it was organised by private contractors, they made a mess of it, it appears. It's under investigation at the moment. And COVID has spread. So we've got now large community transmission in the one state that decided to outsource and privately provide security for these people who are coming back from other countries. So, yeah, okay.
I mean, for comparison, I guess, my understanding is that South Korea is an incredibly densely populated country, and they had their first reported case, I think, on the same day as the United States, and they've had less than 300 deaths from COVID-19. That number might be slightly unreported, but, I mean, the number is unbelievably lower, like less than 15,000 reported cases. But they did that with a more heavy-handed approach that people in the U.S. might not be comfortable with, where the government was far more involved with tracing everybody, quarantining people that were sick. And I mean, that seems to have been the superior, I guess, way of dealing with the problem than whatever the hell the United States is doing. Yeah.
I've also been getting back to China, although I found out yesterday, this has changed a little bit recently, but because I was talking to someone who's worked in China and on China, but up until quite recently, the last decade or so of their fight against using coal has been absolutely spectacular. So the amount of, let me see if I can pull up some.
Their investment in green energy has been
staggering. Yeah, just absolutely incredible. And it's been a central planning thing. Now it hasn't been entirely for sort of benefiting the world motives. They've been very concerned about pollution in their cities, and so they've been driven to a large extent by political expediency, but they've just done an amazing thing on the environment. Apparently that's changing a bit now. They're starting to commission more coal plants, so we'll see what happens in the future. But so it seems that under certain circumstances, when there's a relatively small number of objectives, it seems to me that central planning or a very centrally directed approach by the government, which doesn't respect profit motives as much as you might under normal circumstances, seems to work for some problems. Would you agree with that?
Maybe. So this gets a lot more complicated because So I've heard the description of China as state capitalist is usually the working definition that I use. So basically, China is a capitalist country, but it's the state that owns the capital. So China is very much concerned with making a profit motive, It's just that China has the ability to be more long-term with how they see things, is the opinion that I have. And I don't have like a huge world history understanding, but like when I look at the difference between China and the United States, less than a comparison of economic systems, I usually see it as the difference between like an authoritarian / totalitarian regime versus a democratically elected body. One of the strengths I feel that China has is that if they feel like they can do something that will turn out good in 10 years, they can do that and they can ignore all political pressure for it because they don't have to worry about losing elections. In the United States, if we want to do something like there have been times where people have wanted to do things that they feel benefit the country, but it costs them elections. So, for instance, we had a huge crime bill in the 90s that banned assault weapons, and a lot of us felt that was important. And the party that was involved in that, getting assault weapons banned, they lost all of their seats in Congress the following election for it. Or the ACA, the Affordable Care Act for Barack Obama, where we tried to give healthcare to the United States for various reasons, a lot of people didn't like different parts of it or whatever, and we didn't even get the full thing, and Obama lost his election after that. It seems like when you have a more democratically accountable body, whatever you do, you have to prioritize short-term projects, almost like a firm does kind of to like shareholders, because anything that's long-term that requires like a short-term bump is going to be politically unpopular, and you're going to get forced out of office trying to pursue it. I feel like that's China's main strength, is they don't have to respond well to they don't have to respond well to like political pressure like democratic bodies do.
They don't have to be as populist.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. I suppose. Yeah, I agree. Actually, what you said earlier about democracy struck a chord with me. I think that democracy. I think when people complain about their political leaders,
wait, oh my God, I'm sorry. I need to clarify something real quick. I'm sorry because people are freaking out. Some people are saying Obama lost midterms. My understanding is that Obama only had both halves of Congress for one like session, but that for the next 3 midterms that Obama didn't have Congress at all. Did I miss that incorrect, or did I misstate something? What are you guys talking about? Obama won his re-election, but he didn't have Congress at all. You said the Democrats lost like their elections, like their midterms following. Okay, sorry, I'm just making sure people understand it. Sorry. Okay, okay, go ahead.
You're looking at the stream and I'm not, so that's probably.
I know. Sometimes I slip when I say something, so I want to make sure that I'm being clear with what I'm saying. Okay, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, I agree with what you say about democracy. I think it's very strange when people complain about their leaders in a democratic system. I mean, in a sense, it's okay to complain about them, but you have to remember that you're looking at probably a pretty good representation of a lot of people.
Which I think a lot of people don't understand sometimes. And that's actually been one of the most things that I've had trouble understanding and have finally come to understand over the past year. That because usually it's a bunch of excuses like, oh, corporations run the system, blah, 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 blah. But when you actually look at it, I think that democracy, at least in America, is actually pretty effective, and that the leaders that you see are generally the leaders that people want. Now, whether, there is gerrymandering, there is, some types of voter restrictions that people try to do. But like we've had a big thing about the police recently, for instance, in the United States, where a lot of people don't like how our police forces go. But the police commissioners themselves, those people generally come from the mayors, and mayoral elections in the United States will have like 20% turnout. So, I mean, it seems like the system is working as intended. Like the mayor is usually trying to satisfy his constituents. It's just that all the people that care the most about these issues don't seem to be voting on them. So you wouldn't expect the elected officials to do anything in regards to them, which has been like my unfortunate realization, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, in democracy, if you look at South Africa at various times, or Nazi Germany before it became Nazi Germany, or ancient Greece, the way that some of the ideas they had about the sexual mentoring of teenagers and so on. Democracy just puts in place the will of the people, and if the people are misguided or deluded about something, democracy is powerless against that. In fact, it's actually very good at implementing the will of the people.
Unfortunately, sometimes.
Yeah. Okay. You got time for another question?
Yeah, sure. I feel like China's main strength is their ability to like trudge forward through like democratically unpopular things because of their form of government. So like for like one of my the saddest things that I see happening around the world, especially since like 2013, since the Syrian stuff, is that when people get scared, I think this is true of like individuals and societies. It seems like when we get scared, we tend to look inward. So whether that's, the UK leaving the EU, the United States abandoning NAFTA and the TPP, and everybody just kind of like wants to kind of buckle down and take care of themselves. It's very foreign to, when you're scared, to reach outward and to look outward. And I think China has done a tremendous job of that with their Belt Road program, with the building of the trade ports, like all over Africa and East Asia or whatever, with the relationships that they're forming educationally between people in Africa. I feel like they're doing such a tremendous job of that, and they don't have to worry about responding to like a scared population because the government just knows what's the best thing to do for the future. And that's really scary and sad to me, to see the Western world kind of crumble under their own insecurities, while China is making such great strides forward in like all areas to be like the new kind of like dominating power, I guess, in the world.
Yeah, fear and paranoia is a bit like COVID, isn't it? That magic number R is greater than 1. It can kind of spread very, very effectively.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, look, thanks for that. So I wanted to go to another debate with the guy called Dark Vapor, and you outlined a social philosophy there, but you did say, in fairness, I should say this in fairness to you, that it was kind of how you thought of things at the time, but it was changing, it was old, and so I just wanted to clarify what the new one, or if it's significantly different. It went like this. I am self-interested, others are too. I'm paraphrasing slightly. It's your position, so tell me, change anything. I'm self-interested, others are too. That's point 1. Point 2, I need to motivate others to take me into account. Point 3, I need a society where people have incentives to treat me well. And point 4, this leads to what you call the quasi-social contract position. For example, the context is you were talking about abortion, but it doesn't have to be abortion. The quasi-social contract position was we all agree not to murder each other. And that's if those rules are in place, then that'll be a way of making self-interested people look after your interests.
Yeah. Or number 4, even a step further, is that like we should probably be promoting the well-being of each other to maximize the well-being of everybody. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. It's true. Okay. Social contract position is not necessarily just about negatives; it can be about positives as well. Point taken. And then you went on. This is kind of a separate argument, but in that conversation, you went on to say that might mean protecting the life of fetuses. But then I've heard other things that you said where I haven't got that impression, so I wasn't.
Abortion is like, I'm like 51-49 like pro-abortion right now. That's a really, really, really hard one for me. The biggest problem that I have with abortion is that like I feel like every conversation about abortion necessarily drives itself back to an area that just kind of sits outside the boundaries of being able to make any like definitive statements. Like, so for instance, like what, like, when is a human life protectable, or what is a human life, or what does it mean to be like a human that is worth? I feel like some of these questions get to be like very, very difficult, or even like unknowable in terms of like these are all arbitrarily moral decisions at the end of the day. They usually come down. Or sorry, go ahead.
Oh, and in that video, you said that you were opposed to a capabilities view of what the human person was.
Yeah, I don't think that, well, unless that capability is something like fundamental, like having a conscious experience or something. In terms of like intellectual capabilities or whatever, no. It seems like you could never set a bar that every human would pass above that like fetuses wouldn't, or something. I don't know, that gets weird. When you start to say like, oh, if you can do this or this or that, now you're worth protections. It's like, okay, well, here's an example of a person that for whatever reason doesn't meet that threshold. Can we kill them? It seems like the answer to that is almost never going to be, yeah, kill them, right?
And if it's consciousness, then I don't want to go camping with those people, because when I'm asleep next to them, they might bump me off and be morally okay about it because I'm asleep.
Yeah, well, that's where I'm at right now, though. So, where it's, yeah,
we're not going camping. We're not going camping.
No, yeah, sure, yeah, probably not a good idea. But it seems like very hard to make the. I can do it from a normative ethics level, not a meta ethics level. I can say that we probably shouldn't kill people in their sleep, because then everybody's going to be worried about sleeping next to anybody, because anybody could be killed at any point in time. But from like a meta ethical level, like it seems like if you die in your sleep, it's kind of hard to identify a material harm there. If you never really know you're dying, it'd be the same as killing a fetus. It doesn't know it's dying. It doesn't have the wherewithal to know. But these conversations are so esoteric and hard to have that like I always go kind of like back and forth. I sit like right in the middle of that pro or anti-abortion needle. Yeah.
So well, let's go back to the framework.
And
leave the particular issue aside.
Mm-hmm.
There's something that that I thought about the step between, or the movement between step 2 and step 3. So step 2 was, I need to motivate them to take me into account.
Mm-hmm.
And step 3 is, I need a society where people have incentives to treat me well.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I'm not saying this is illogical or inconsistent, but it does seem arbitrary to me, because if your starting point was you're self-interested and others are too, and you need to get other people to look after you,
mm-hmm.
I'm not sure you do need a society where people have incentives to treat you well. There are other ways. Well, it depends what you mean by incentives, I guess. You could amass enough money, or you could become a dictator. There are all sorts of ways, maybe not so easy for you personally, but there are other ways of getting people to take account of your interests than creating a society where everyone's nice to each other.
Yeah, I mean, like, this is a pretty common challenge brought up. So whether you're the owner of like a slave plantation, or whether you've like, you know, got indentured servants, or in some totalitarian dictatorship, you're able to control the masses. I guess like my response to this is I'm usually looking for like the most effective way to do things. And it seems like those systems don't last very long, or at least not that I'm aware of, that like these massive slave things tend to either crumple in on themselves or become electorally unpopular or unpopular with the population or the subjected population. And that you also end up getting worse outcomes, that like rather than having 100 people enslaved to me, you know, like serving my needs, you know, having 100 people around me that are like thriving and doing well probably would even serve my needs better. It's a greater group of people for me to have friends with. It's a greater group of people to like contribute to society with. That like generally I feel like that structure is more tenacious, is more resistant to like a little bit of pressure, whereas like if you're like a dictator, if somebody gets the opportunity to kill you instantly, they'll do it. It seems like those systems are a little bit more shaky or on the foundations, I would say. It seems to be the case.
But you're appealing to other criteria now. You're not appealing to just being self-interested and needing other people to appeal your needs. You're appealing to, say, a need for community or having friends around you. So why don't you put those as your premises and start out there? Because you're already using them, so why don't you start there?
Yeah, I mean, I guess you could. I guess maybe I feel like that might be like a subset of like my own well-being. Like I feel like it's pretty fundamental to human, but maybe I'm including too much then in a premise there. But I feel like me being able to socialize with people is like a pretty fundamental nature of like me being a human. That's something that's going to be part of my well-being. Like if I could create like a master race of robots to serve every need, but I had no human interaction for the rest of my life, that's probably not serving my interests very well, because as a human, you're pretty interested in social contact, I would imagine.
So you could put that in a number of ways, couldn't you? You could say that relationships are important, socializing is important, and it's important that people do that freely and not under coercion, and then that would lead you to a different, that will support the kinds of systems that you want to support, rather than being a dictator or something like that.
Yeah, I would say so. Having friends that are friends with you not because they're scared you're going to kill them probably feels better than having servants or people afraid of their lives. I would imagine so, I guess. I haven't had people that I've threatened to murder if they're not friends with me. Maybe someday I'll experience that, but not yet.
Okay, I'm glad to hear that. Well, then it doesn't really sound that this is your position, to be honest. It sounds as though there's a lot of other things that come into it. So it doesn't really start from I'm self-interested, others are too, and I've got to make other people look after me. There's other things involved.
Yeah, I mean, I guess there could be. This is kind of the problem. The main contention I've heard with my description of this, which I kind of agree with, is that being self-interested, that term is a little bit vacuous, because self-interested can mean so many different things that it's almost a worthless starting point. So for instance, like you're telling... It can be
called logical. You can say that whatever I do is by definition in my self-interest. This is
exactly
what a lot of economists and utilitarians do when they're modeling things, and they say, we assume that everyone's self-interested, but then when you say with that, it actually goes by another name. It goes by the name of utility maximizing. Everybody's a utility maximizer.
Yeah.
And then
utility is so different.
By definition, is what maximizes their utility. So
yeah,
it's a
vacuum. Yeah, because utility to one person might be the acquisition of the most valuable goods in a society, whereas utility in another person might be forming the most number of relationships with people at their church. So saying that people maximize utility isn't really a meaningful statement in and of itself. To some person, maximizing utility might be murdering as many people as possible that stay at a hotel. Yeah, I understand that. I don't know how to get around that, but
another thing you said to me, which was interesting, was you said you were a rural utilitarian. Do you want to just explain what that means to you? And I've got some questions about it.
Sure, yeah. So when it comes to normative ethics, I always hear like different challenges given to like virtue ethics or deontological systems or utilitarian systems. I guess like the big challenge that I hear in rejection of like utilitarianism is like, if you could kill one person to save 5 people, would you do it? And well, the answer to utilitarian, it must be yes, But the realistic answer is that if we were to say that in a utilitarian model, you should kill one person to save 5 people, we've created a very strange world because basically nobody can see any other person out of fear that they're going to be murdered for the good of society. Nobody can go to a hospital anymore. Nobody can see anybody with a weapon anymore because at any point in time, my life could be killed, right? So like I've heard this like fleshed out a little bit more. I don't know if these are like official positions, but I've heard like a distinction made between act utilitarianism versus rule utilitarianism. And the idea is that a rule utilitarian is somebody that constructs a rule that when applied evenly across society kind of ensures like the benefit of all of society, even if in a particular manner it doesn't seem like that rule is utilitarian. So for instance, a rule utilitarian might say killing one person to save 5 people does not produce a good outcome because if we apply that rule evenly across society, well, now we've basically destroyed society by trying to improve it. So yeah. And then I've also had people challenge me and say, well, wouldn't that just be normal utilitarianism if you follow it down enough? And maybe it would be, but yeah.
So I want to go back to what we were talking about, central planning, for a second.
Sure.
So a rule utilitarian, if I understand it correctly, has to work out what rules will lead to the greatest good for the greatest number in all the circumstances that a rule might apply.
Yeah.
Now, given your unease with central planning because of the informational requirements that it has, how do you do the calculations for rule utilitarianism? How do you actually go through and calculate all the possible circumstances that a rule might apply in, and the pleasure minus pain, depends how you want to define greatest good for the greatest number, but have you done the math?
I mean, I imagine there'd be like probably a great deal of generalizing there. I mean, it's impossible to. I see the distinction you're drawing. The irony of me being a rule utilitarian who also argues that economically we can't have the central planning because the calculation problem makes it an untenable position. But it seems like to be a rule utilitarian to some extent, we would have to engage with said calculations. Yeah, I mean,
they may be worse. They may be worse calculations.
Yeah, for sure.
At least a central planner only has to worry about one economy at one point in time, whereas a rule utilitarian has to prescribe rules that will presumably lead to the greatest good for the greatest number over a whole range of different situations and perhaps even a whole range of societies, if you believe in human rights that apply internationally, for example.
I guess like in terms of thinking about these two things, the problem is that like I can't think of like a capital flowing version of ethics where like ethical capital flows to the most ethical position. So it doesn't really seem like I have any kind of free market way to determine what ethics are or should be, or I don't even know ethically what that would even look like. So I think
we should do that.
What?
I wasn't suggesting.
Oh, yeah. Oh, well, because I'm only thinking is in terms of like the reason why I reject the calculation problem or why I reject, I guess, like central planning is because it seems like capital models, are superior to central planning models. Hence, I prefer the capital version. When it comes to like normative ethics, rule utilitarianism seems to be the best thing I can think of. Kind of like a Rawlsian approach, I guess, to like social justice, the idea that you try to enact the best society that works for the most amount of people. I guess like you have to take into account like a ton of interdisciplinary stuff to figure out what that answer is. But I mean, I don't claim to, or even know if you could ever produce like the most consistent, best method of doing everything. You could just have like a general set of guidelines that you use to try to approach every problem to get answers out of, I guess. But yeah, I don't think a rule utilitarian can have like here's the 42 million commandments to create the best society. I don't know if we could ever do that. Yeah. Yeah,
I don't know how it's feasible. And it seems to me that when people I wonder whether people who are utilitarian, when they're faced with a calculation problem, they either do one of two things. They turn into act utilitarians. They become kind of pragmatic, and whatever situation presents themselves to them, they'll kind of weigh the costs and benefits in that particular situation and proceed accordingly. Mm-hmm. Or maybe they appeal to pre-existing moral intuitions that they have, and then just talk with people who might agree with them that those pre-existing moral intuitions will in fact be the rules that will be the greatest good for the greatest number.
Mm-hmm. I hate to I try to be very careful because you don't want to get bogged down with specific examples when talking about systems, but I feel like I haven't come across a question as a rule utilitarian where I'm like, wow, I have no way to generate any type of moral prescription for this problem. And it doesn't invalidate anything you said, obviously, if you can't. But I'm curious, can you think of like a hypothetical moral question or conundrum I might be in as a rule utilitarian where somebody might say, well, what would you do here? And I'd be like, oh, shoot, like I actually can't even conceive of an answer being a rule utilitarian.
Oh, I hadn't thought about that question before. I think it's too easy to be a rule utilitarian. I can't think of counterexamples because it seems to me that what often happens is that a rule utilitarian will say something that accords with some other pre-existing moral idea, mm-hmm. and then everyone will say, oh, that's a good idea. So no, I can't think of an example where you can't come up with a rule, but the trouble is there are so many moral ideas around that a lot of the rules you'll come up with will seem reasonable. No, so I can't think of a counterexample.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah, just curious. That what you're talking about, how like people say things and they seem reasonable. This is kind of why I hate like all of like meta ethics, and I don't believe in any of it. I don't care about any of it. Is because it seems like it feels to me at the end of the day that like every single meta ethical position, it feels like a post hoc justification of whatever our moral intuitions are, and that at the end of the day we have things that feel right and things that feel wrong, and I don't think you're ever going to debate somebody out of those intuitions or concoct a system that can change somebody's moral intuitions. Like the example that I give is that like if there was a lost chapter of Kant that was found, and he had perfect moral philosophy and gave us like the perfect rules. And in this lost chapter, it says something like, "Oh, well, actually, these moral goods would actually involve like killing children, like killing once somebody hits 4 years old, we kill 50% of all children." And even if it was like perfectly argued, perfectly rational, 100% logical, I think most people would just reject it because it goes against their moral intuition so much. Which makes me super skeptical of everything in meta ethics. At the end of the day, it all feels like very self-serving. That's how I feel, I guess. I don't know if that's reasonable or rational. Or, yeah.
I don't know either. You said something fascinating in that interview. You said, let me see if I can find it. Oh, yeah, you said that you would share a lot with a decent Christian, not like an evangelical conservative, someone who wants to make society better for everyone, care about everyone, wants people to do well. Mm-hmm. And I found that an intriguing statement because, why is that? Why do you think you share so much moral common ground with a decent Christian?
I don't know. I mean, the Jesus guy in the gospel seemed like a pretty chill dude. I mean, it seemed like he walked around. He wanted everybody to have healthcare. He wanted everybody to be respectful of society. He wanted people to keep their obligations to the government were important. Their obligations to their faith was important. Their obligations to family was important. The way that you treat your fellow human being was incredibly important.
He didn't provide everyone with the internet, but that's all right.
At the time
things have been different then.
They had angels that could like teleport around and stuff, so they didn't have a need for it, I guess. They didn't have to use Zoom. But I had you guys have Jesuit schools in Australia, don't you? I feel like I've heard of these before. Yeah, I went to a Jesuit high school, and my education there was, I don't want to say like a secular version of Jesus, but it was very much a like, I guess like the version of Jesus that I learned in that school was like pretty like chill for anybody. It would be pretty hard pressed to find a lot of issues with I guess how the Gospels, especially in the Jesus of the Gospels, was presented there, and the life teachings and everything seem to be pretty applicable to day-to-day life.
What did you like most about the Jesus that was presented there?
Well, I mean, I guess at the end of the day, my social contract stuff kind of sounds like Jesus's golden rule. I say Jesus's, but I'm pretty sure like 15 different people have had this at some variation, but like treat other people how you want to be treated. Seems like a pretty good general approach to how you ought to act in life towards other people. It usually creates the best outcomes for yourself because then people treat you in a respectful manner, and then helps you build relationships and move through life in a pretty positive way, and helps everybody move through life in a pretty positive way.
Yeah, because I remember you were also talking about the social contract theory, and you said that you were happy with it because it generated what you considered to be decent answers for a lot of questions. Mm-hmm. And that sounded as though there were other criteria that when you get to the end of a chain of reasoning about social contract theory, you get somewhere, and then you use other criteria to judge how that looks, and they were what you called decent answers. Mm-hmm. I agree with you. It's difficult to. People do have really strong moral intuitions, and they seem to me to be a combination of all sorts of things. They seem to be a combination of backgrounds and how people think about these things, meta-ethics and so on. Why did you say? I'm a bit scared to ask this.
Oh no!
Why did you say that not like an evangelical conservative Christian? You said that I would share a lot with a decent Christian, not a conservative evangelical.
Oh, I don't know how it goes. It wouldn't surprise me. It's probably similar in Australia. I don't know your particular political background, I guess. So at the risk of saying something offensive, I guess, it's very weird to me in the United States how religion is weaponized by conservatives as this like tool of the wealthy. I find it incredibly difficult to reconcile the version of Jesus that exists in the Bible with the weird pick yourself up by the bootstraps, don't help your fellow man, don't do anything via government or whatever that conservatives seem to have in the United States is very, very, very strange to me. I don't understand.
Yeah, well, I don't understand much of that either, actually. That's not how I understand Jesus at all. Mm-hmm. Okay, so when you said a conservative evangelical, that was politically conservative, yeah?
Yeah, I'm sorry, that not socially. I'm more specific. Republican evangelical in the United States refers to our right-leaning political party. Yeah.
Okay.
I'm sure there's a lot of like, depending on what you mean by socially conservative, because that could be anywhere from like, I just want to get married and have kids, all the way to I hate LGBT people and think all gay people should be killed. That could mean a lot of different things. But like, yeah, I imagine there are some conservative evangelical people that I would share a decent number of positions with, depending on what that means to them. Yeah.
I mean, one of the things that does seem to inform your thinking is the value of people, and that's and in some sense the equality of people. Equality is a bit of a slippery idea, but that does seem to be part of your thinking, and that certainly is something that you get from Christianity, either by believing it or perhaps through education or something like that. Mm-hmm. I'll be very interested to know what happens in the future in society when people, in an increasingly post-Christian society, I'll be very interested, an increasingly post-Christian society, and one where free market liberalism, where prices determine the values for things, and that's what people gravitate to. I'll be very interested to know how ideas of intrinsic equality of people go in the future. Do you have any predictions about that?
I think that religion is probably very, very, very important to people. That seems to be the case. I don't like Jung or any of that shit, but it feels like there are probably certain things that we've done through all of human history that are pretty important to humans. And one of those things is organizing like a set of stories and rituals to explain who we are, where we come from, where we're going, and how we ought to act. And that stripping away all of that just because of some shitty theology is probably not a good or effective way to organize people in like happy units. So I hope that we get more secular organization of like rituals or community building or something. Some type of like Sunday or Saturday church you could go to that just doesn't have the theology, but maybe you talk to some guy. Like, because the idea of like weekly mass or temple or whatever your faith is like pretty important, right? A guy that's pretty knowledgeable gives you advice on how to walk through different things in life. You talk to a lot of people in your community, like that seems to be a really important ritual. And we kind of totally threw that out the window when we got rid of Christian theology, or at least we are in the Western world. So hopefully that gets replaced someday. That was kind of messy at it.
I think people have tried that. I think there have been kind of atheist churches. I don't know much about them, and obviously I wouldn't go to them because I'm not an atheist. But sure. I think people have tried that. I don't. Yeah.
It's a lot harder
yeah,
to hold people together, though, when you don't have, like, the authority of God to do it, you know? Yeah, I would imagine.
Yeah, yeah. There are a lot of interesting thinkers around at the moment who seem to who are thinking about why it is that religion seems to provide valuable things for people and yet can't bring themselves to believe it. So as far as I understand a guy like Jordan Peterson, and I'm not sure I understand him
Sure.
on this issue, he
I don't even
seems
know
to be...
if he understands himself, but yeah.
Yeah, right. Yeah, so, I mean, I actually don't have a trouble. I don't have... Well, I have some problems, but I actually believe it. So it's relatively easier for me. But I gather that you don't.
Yeah, no, I'm very, very atheist, but I think that, like, I understand that religion answers a lot of very valuable questions. Like, I don't know how much value there is in thinking about, like, what is the purpose of life if you're dedicating a vast amount of time thinking of these questions. Whereas if a religion could just tell you, like, hey, you know, you should be nice to your friends and family and be a productive member of society. I'm like, oh, cool. Don't have to waste time thinking about that. And then you just go and do those things. It probably produces more happiness than getting stuck in some existential or nihilistic dread. Yeah. From the way that humans are built, that seems to be the case.
I suppose there's a sense of personal integrity that comes to that unravels if you try and do things if you try and hold on to doing things that you don't have a good reason for. So John Paul Sartre called that bad faith, where you so for example, you might believe in the you might act as though you believe in the intrinsic worth of people when your worldview doesn't really have a reason for doing that. And John Paul Sartre called that bad faith. It's kind of a compromised way to live, in a sense.
I think that integrity part is really important, because that's why I am the way that I am, is because I like to feel like, well, I must have some intellectual integrity. But I think the problem is that, like, once you get to that position, it seems to be almost impossible to get out of it. But you don't actually know at the end of the day if that's producing a better outcome for you. So, for instance, if somebody is on their deathbed and he is highly critical but very intellectually honest, doesn't believe in God because he's looked at all the evidence and he thinks it's stupid and he's about to die and it's whatever, you know, is that guy better off for it, as opposed to, you know, an old guy that's about to die but he feels happy, he thinks he's going to a better place, he's lived his whole life being reasonably certain that he's got a purpose, that everything happens for a reason, you know, blah, blah, blah. Like, at the end of the day, what does the man with the intellectual integrity have to show for it? I don't think intellectual integrity in and of itself, like, suits an end. I used to think that, but I don't actually think it does anymore, especially if it only serves to make you less happy. It seems kind of silly to pursue that so much when other people that aren't seem to be better off for it. Or that would be the way that I would view it, I guess, if that makes sense. That sounds a little condescending, though, like, oh, you're so dumb that you're happier for it, but yeah.
I've never thought about that. I've always thought that I mean, I'm not claiming that I have perfect intellectual integrity, but I've always thought that it's something that's sort of an intrinsic good. It's something that it's hard to plan not to have it, or it's hard to value not having it. Although, sorry, maybe I didn't understand you. You said the happiness.
Happiness is important, yeah, not intellectual integrity, intellectuality or whatever in and of itself. I used to think that it was good in and of itself, and then I did a lot of drugs, and I don't think that anymore. But yeah.
Why? Well, what's the connection there?
I had I had a very, very big drug experience, basically, that started to make me feel a lot of doubt about how certain I could be about literally anything. So, for instance, one thing that I intellectually knew before, but I didn't emotionally know, was that our reality is constructed in our brain, right? Like, I don't actually go out and collect all the information. Like, my brain is putting together a picture of the world constantly. And intellectually, we should all know this. But to take like a certain type of drug and to mess with your senses a lot, and then to come away like emotionally understanding that you can't really be sure of necessarily anything, like, that's a piece of knowledge that I've acquired, and I don't think that serves me in a positive way ever. It actually just makes me feel incredibly uncomfortable. And then that dramatically changed how I view intellectuality, and that, well, I think that the only time intellectuality is good is if I can use that to make me happier. So, for instance, medicine isn't good because coming up with vaccines is fun. Medicine is good because it serves an end. It's an instrument that we use to make ourselves happier. Or physics is the same. We make better cars, you know, because of engineers. Or math can be the same because we, you know, design different systems that make people happier. That at the end of the day, all all it is like intellectuality or science is an instrument that people can utilize to produce better happiness outcomes for people, and that if you can't, it doesn't seem like there's much of a purpose for it, in my opinion, I guess.
I don't know whether being happy is a good end in itself. I mean, you look at people, I don't know what you think of the protests at the moment about Black Lives Matter, but think of any kind of worthy cause that you might support. The protesters who are involved in that are generally not very happy, but I suppose you could say they're pursuing long-term happiness for a large number of people.
Yeah, basically, yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
I guess like one question. Actually, I'm curious. I guess what the answer you would say to this is like, let's say that somebody could give you the very specific time and date in which you would die. Would you want to have that information, or would you not want to have that information?
That's a really interesting question. I've thought about this because I've wondered whether I would like to die by surprise or whether I'd like to have a terminal illness. And the advantage of the terminal illness is that you could say goodbye to people.
Settle your affairs. Yeah.
You could sort out any unresolved conflicts that you have with people, ask for forgiveness and so on. But on the other hand, I don't know that I'd like to know when I'm going to die. So what's your answer?
I feel like I almost feel like you're obligated to say you wouldn't want to know. But maybe there are different people that are built in different ways. I think if it was going to happen like in an hour, maybe I'd want to know, because like, okay, well, at the very least, I should send all my money to somebody.
Poor mom.
What? Yeah.
Poor mom.
But like if it was like in a year, would you be like so tortured by the decision or by that knowledge that you're incapable of spending the rest of your happy? Or actually, that thing, right? Like, would you spend the rest of your time like so miserably that you should have never known regardless? A separate but kind of similar question is, let's say that, do you have any children?
I do.
Let's say that you're on your deathbed, okay, and you have a terminal illness and you're minutes away from death. Let's say that right before you perish, let's say that all of your children are killed in a car accident. Right before you're passing, would you prefer, you ask like, oh, like, how are the children doing? Like, blah, blah, blah. Would you prefer them to tell you, like, all of your children have just died, or everybody's happy, like, good luck? Would you want to know that in the final, like, minutes of your life?
Oh, boy. Well, I wouldn't want to know it. But I guess if I asked someone and I guess I want them to tell me the truth. That's strange, isn't it? I can't work that one out.
And so, like, the fact that you have to stop and think about that, because if you would have asked me 2 years ago, my answer is that intelligence or knowledge or information is valuable in and of itself. So anytime you give me access to it, I always want it, of course. But when people ask you that and you have to stop and think, what in my opinion, the stopping and thinking shows that there's actually a deeper evaluation going on there. And what you're trying to think is will this information benefit me? So at the end of the day, the question isn't like, oh, well, I want all information. It's more, I want information that makes me happy. But generally, when we acquire more information, it usually makes us happier. But if you have to stop and think, then the information, because it should be an easy question, like, do you want some piece of information? Well, yeah, of course, I always want information. But rather, well, hold on, I need to stop and think how that information is going to make me feel. Well, in that case, it seems like you really want information that's going to better your life. That's I guess, how I feel about it.
Yeah, I suppose the only thing I can think of that's relevant here is, So in the Bible, there's this idea of speaking the truth in love, which is an interesting combination because it's talking about the value of both of them, the value of relationship and the value of truth, and somehow weaving them together seems important. So I guess in some situations the raw truth needs to dominate. In some situations, it's the relational concern or how which I guess is related to how someone's feeling, but it's not entirely that. Not entirely that.
Yeah.
Was there anything you want to ask me? I feel I've exhausted my questions.
You don't have public debates I can watch, so it's harder for me to have like a ton of. You said Australia's doing pretty good when it comes to handling the disease and everything?
Yeah, we've been very blessed, really. I mean, it's a combination of good luck and good management. This is just my opinion. The government just seemed to act quick enough. It seemed that in those early days, if you just waited a week or two, things could blow up and get out of hand, and we were just lucky that we acted early. Australia's only got a much smaller number of states. It's got 6 states and 2 territories. And so the Prime Minister just arranged a national cabinet where all the state premiers and he sat together and just tried to coordinate everything. And then there was that thing about locking people away in hotels and keeping police and defence forces there so that they just couldn't leave for 2 weeks. And that meant that there was very, very little community transmission. But all that appears to be going out the window now. So one of the southern states in Victoria, there's been a big outbreak and a lot of community transmission. So who knows?
Here's a question I had related to our earlier conversation. My understanding is that in Australia, you guys have like mandatory voting. Otherwise, you are either fined or you get like a tax.
I was thinking about that before when you were talking about the mayoral elections, actually.
Yeah. How do you feel about that? Do you think that's good? Do you think that's bad? What's your thought?
It's hard when you grow up with a system, you're so used to it. I like it because you never have this weird discussion at election time about turnout and how turnout's going to affect everything. You just don't have that discussion. I do understand that people talk about, there used to be a joke, I don't know if it was true, that the only two places in the world where voting was compulsory was the Soviet Union and Australia. I don't know if that's true or not, but there's sort of an irony about democracy where you force people
to
and find them
because
vote.
Arguably not voting should be a right. The common response I've heard from Australians is that, well, if you don't want to vote, you can show up and write in like a fake candidate or something if you want to protest vote or something.
Yes, it's called, or a donkey vote is a less complimentary way of saying it. You just go in and mark the paper and walk out.
Yeah.
I think I like it because it means that that freak events or a snowstorm. And is it true in the US that the elections aren't even on weekends necessarily or public holidays?
No, we don't have a public holiday for it. We don't have it on weekends. I think they're on like Tuesdays or Thursdays. It's a nightmare.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. And what happens if people can't make it for work reasons? Oh, that doesn't matter. They don't get fined. You don't get fined. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
All right. Now, well, I like my system, but I guess it's the talking about intuitions and gut reactions, often what you grow up with, what you're used to.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Do you what's like the general view in Australia? I'm always curious to hear. Like, does the American political system seem especially theatric, or are you guys pretty comparable down there? Or
I can't begin to describe to you how the American political system seems.
Okay.
But I've got to be careful here. It's not my country, and
okay.
I'm sure. I've noticed. I get onto the BBC website, and I noticed that the way that Australia's portrayed, there's always a picture of some furry animal or some eccentricity. So, yeah, where we get portrayed a certain way. No, I just can't. I just can't fathom the genius of President Trump, because I don't think anybody else could see that you could turn international politics into a trashy Facebook post or a tweet or something like that. Mm-hmm. It's absolutely astonishing. I wouldn't vote for him if I'm honest. I don't admire him in so many levels, but to be able to see that is extraordinary. Just the transformation in public life is just extraordinary.
Mm-hmm.
But you asked a question about theatre. Were you just thinking of the president?
No, I mean, I think you kind of answered it pretty well. I think I understand. Yeah, it's weird because like U.S. culture and politics is exported so much, around the world, and we don't necessarily see other people's as much. So sometimes it's hard. Like I'll turn on the Canadian debates, for instance, and they are people standing around, on their podiums, and they're having what seems to be like somewhat reasonable discussion about policy. And in the United States debates, we've got audiences clapping and applauding. We've got people making jokes about the size of their dick. It's incredibly unbelievable. So, Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, look, I would say that I had a discussion with a very good friend of mine who's conservative in the US, mm-hmm. and I understood and respected for the first time something about the position which I didn't really understand before. So I think we've talked about this before, but she has a communitarian perspective, and the basic idea, which I'm sure you've heard before, is that, and actually it's not dissimilar to your position about economics and about central planning. Mm-hmm. The idea is that the local level, decisions are far better made at a local level, and that the further away the decision-making body gets from the local level is you get more and more suspicious and more concerned about it. And so that, so this idea is that, big central government's bad and so on and so on and so on. Mm-hmm. And it was very well argued, and I I could sort of understand it in a way that I haven't been able to understand it before. And it also helped me understand perhaps how Christians get involved in conservative politics. And I'm speaking with wild generalizations here. I could be completely wrong. But, generally speaking, Christians value community and value having an actual impact and helping people, that really works. And you can live your life reading lots of media and learning about world affairs and living a kind of life where you're completely just immersed in what's going on at a national, international level and not really caring about what happens locally. And I think a lot of Christians sort of aren't like that. And so I think they find that kind of idea of valuing local interactions with real people very highly. So I found all that kind of interesting.
Yeah, I was going to bring that up earlier, to be fair, but that it seems to be entirely congruent with my understanding of it as well, that politically, the United States has a great history of localization of politics, especially in the 60s. That started to change with the Civil Rights Act, where...
When you say great history, do you mean that in a complimentary way?
Or no, I just mean, I don't know if it's good or bad, but it was a large part of American history. It was local politics. Okay. It was a large part of American history. It was localized politics. And that typically people that saw themselves as conservatives, they had their government, their structure, their support was their community. They knew all the local leaders. They had their union leaders that they'd go to local meetings with. They went to their parishes, their community churches that they would go, and that was how they identified. And those were the structures that they wanted set up to help each other and help everybody. And the idea of a federal government coming in from the outside, so that somebody in Washington, D.C. could come down to my city and tell me how we ought to run things, was a very foreign and uncomfortable idea to a lot of conservative type people at the time. That they much preferred, if we need to help each other, we know all of our neighbors, we know everybody that goes to our church, we see our local city officials down at the bar we go to every night, we can do this locally. Why would we want Washington coming in, especially when they started to make unpopular changes, especially related to the Civil Rights Act, that upset a lot of people. So I can understand that more community-minded aspect, if I'm being generous towards conservatives, at least in the United States. I do understand, and I can kind of empathize with that. And actually, in some ways, that method of thinking is even superior to more liberal types who are very internationalized about everything. Because it's very sexy to be involved in international politics and national level politics and who's running for the Senate and who's in the House. Who's your school superintendent? I don't know. I don't care. Who's your chief of police? I don't know. I don't care. It's these are the people that you see every day that actually impact you. And in some ways, that loss of respect for local politics has hurt the United States, I think, in a lot of ways.
That's interesting. Mm-hmm. I mean, I've got two. So I have two concerns about that view, or two qualifiers, I guess. One is what happens when the issue that you're dealing with is necessarily national. So something like COVID. It just doesn't work very well to have localized responses. You seem to want to have coordination at a national level. So that kind of communitarian focus, it doesn't make as much sense to me.
Yeah, I agree.
And the other thing is what happens when the local communities fail in a really bad way. And I care about this personally because I came from a family that was very difficult and dysfunctional, and I think that. So I have a lot of sympathy with. I actually agree in the goodness of the family unit and so on. Mm-hmm. I think it's a good God-given thing, but sometimes it works appalling. It doesn't work well at all, and sometimes it can be really evil. And then I think you actually need external bodies to come in and do something about that. And so I sort of understand people wanting to intervene in situations. Or you mentioned the example of racism, I guess, where a local community might be really racist and someone else comes in from the outside. And I think that's a good thing.
Yeah. I usually give the caveat, I understand, but I don't condone. So obviously I would agree with both points. I mean, with the civil rights era, the federal government had to come in because you wouldn't expect a community full of racist people to not be racist anymore. You need some sort of external pressure there. And then a lot of issues are just better dealt with on a national level. Trying to administer healthcare locally to every single community across the United States is probably far more difficult than just taking in all the money in a central body, dishing it all out in a central body. Seems to probably be a better way of dealing with things than doing it all locally.
And then you have the problem that some states might be a lot poorer. And so I don't know if this system works in the US, but if a lot of states are poorer, it just seems to make sense to me to want to have people in a country have the same approximate level of healthcare.
We don't normally think about state wealth as much because if we did, I think things would look a lot weirder because I think most of the so many weird things get conflated. So, for instance, I think bluer states, more democratic ones, like Democrat left, tend to be wealthier than red or Republican states. And within those red or Republican states, your highest economic output is usually coming from blue or Democratic areas rather than Republican areas. But that's not really a consequence of any political leaning. That's more just the trend towards like mega cities in the world and all of your urban people all moving together. By being around each other, they're going to be exposed to more types of people, probably makes them a little bit more socially liberal, and then they grow up more politically liberal. And so it's not necessarily like a political reason why those places are blue or red, although it becomes political, I guess. But yeah, I don't think that we would have trouble splitting things out between poorer states or wealthier states because I don't think we generally separate that way in the United States. We usually divide more on like rural or urban lines, who lives in the country versus who lives in cities, or even just like state lines, but not like money contributed federally by state, I think.
What's your prediction for COVID in the US over the next 6 months?
Man, I just don't know. Things are so unbelievably bad. Honestly, I didn't think we would make it this far with our current levels of lockdown because I didn't think economically we'd be able to bear it. I thought there'd been too much political pressure or something, or maybe they will be coming this election where stuff. I like the end thing that I always saw in mind was that at some point we're just going to say, screw it, we're going to open everything and just watch a bunch of people die and then hit that 50-60% immunity level and just move forward and be like, hopefully that doesn't happen again. And then everybody's going to forget about it and just move on. That's kind of where I would expect it to go, just because that's like the simplest solution that requires the least amount of political capital to move anything towards.
Yeah, I was wondering whether that will eventually happen too. I mean, I've been very impressed actually that around the world countries have done lockdowns and they've tried to avoid the situation in intensive care units where you've got a small number of ventilators and lots of people and you have to choose who to give the ventilators to. And I think, I'm personally really pleased that countries have tried to avoid those choices, but whether they will in the future, I don't know.
Yeah. I guess Sweden is the prime European example right now that is trying not to do that as much. And then America, nobody knows what America's doing. I'm very curious what like a post COVID-19 world looks like. There are a couple positive. I would hope that like mask wearing is more normalized in, I guess, Western or white countries or whatever. That's something I'd only ever seen in Asian countries before.
I used to think it was eccentric when I saw people walking around Sydney and they had masks on. I think that's eccentric, but it doesn't seem eccentric anymore.
Yeah,
people really started to imagine society differently. Like some people have found lockdown really, really hard, especially if they're living on their own. But some people have actually enjoyed it and found that unhurried community time is really valuable. It's been terrific for the environment in some ways.
I would hope that the people that found it terrific are probably the people that are still managing to socialize more, I would imagine. Because I know this coronavirus stuff has been really hard on people that rely on socialization. I'd be very curious in seeing the post-lockdown suicide numbers, if those have increased as a result of people not being able to travel or socialize more. I imagine it's having negative impacts.
Yeah, I think people living on their own would be absolutely appalling to be in lockdown for that.
Yeah, for sure. But
listen, I've got to go and write some exams. So
I have one final question. Actually, I'm curious because we were watching something earlier. I feel like, do you enjoy grading exams? It must be the most miserable experience in the world. Is it something that you actually enjoy doing, or?
I hate it. I hate it. Now I'm in great trouble here because my students might see this. So there's one situation when I like it, when it's a small number of students and when I've taught them something really difficult, I get a great buzz out of seeing if they've understood something and seeing them wrestle with something. I really enjoy that. And I quite enjoy creating exam questions. That's not the hard work. The hard work is marking them. But no, I don't enjoy marking them. I mark some stuff because there's so much plagiarism on the internet now that I remember reading one essay which started out in terrible, broken, torturous second language.
And then became profoundly academic.
It just broke into beautiful prose with all these references which didn't appear in the bibliography. And then the conclusion, it collapsed again into absolutely torturous English. And I hate marking that kind of thing.
Sure. How big are your like class sizes? Do you teach like grad students or undergrads generally, or?
I've mainly taught undergrads. I'm teaching something with 500 coming up. And that's the other thing about COVID. I think COVID is going to change some jobs forever, and I think academia will be very different from now on. And I think that people who can listen to online lectures will start. I think the university sector will change profoundly, and I don't think it'll ever go back to being the same as it was.
Interesting.
So I'm sad about it, actually, because I love being in front of classes and I love the interaction and I love getting people talking. But I suspect a lot more of it's going to go online.
Okay. Well, good luck grading your stuff. I don't want to keep you too much.
All right. No, great talking.
Yeah, thanks a lot for the
And
conversation.
if you have any economic questions, feel free to drop me a line too. We can have a chat about them.
Sure thing. Thanks a lot. Have a good one.
Bye.
Bye. Editor should have gotten a contract. It sounds like you should have gotten something in writing. It sounds like blah, blah, blah. And it's like, that's an interesting take there, my fellow communists.